Early on the morning of the 18th of April, 1945, in the last weeks of the war in Europe, a 20-year-old American lieutenant named Michael Daly led his company into the ruins of Nuremberg, and then walked out in front of them, alone, into the fire. His men were pinned in the open by a German machine gun firing down a rubble-choked street. It had already cut some of them down, so Daly ordered his company to take cover, and then, by himself, with bullets snapping off the broken stone all around him, he ran straight at the gun. He reached it, and with his carbine he killed all 3 men crewing it. It was the first of 4 times that morning that Michael Daly would go forward alone to do what no one could order a man to do, and Nuremberg was the wrong city to do it in quietly. Nuremberg was not just any German city. It was the place the Nazi Party had made the showpiece of its entire movement, the city of the great rallies, a name soaked in the imagery of the regime, and now, in April 1945, it was a shattered, burning ruin that the German defenders were determined to hold to the last. The fighting there was street by street, house by house, a nightmare of snipers in the rubble, machine guns covering every open space, and hidden defenders in the wreckage of a city that had been pounded from the air for months. Into that, the American 3rd Infantry Division was fighting its way, block by block, and at the head of one company, moving through the sniper-infested wreckage, was Lieutenant Michael Daly, who had already learned, over 11 months of war, that the fastest way to save his men was often to go first himself. So he kept going forward. Having wiped out that first machine gun crew, Daly did not fall back to the safety of his company. He continued advancing at the head of them, ahead of them, scouting the deadly street personally. And it was out there, alone in front of his men, that he saw the next threat, and it was a serious one. A German patrol, 6 men, had set up rocket launchers and was preparing to ambush the American tanks supporting the advance. If they succeeded, they would knock out the armor and the whole attack could stall in the killing ground of the city streets. Daly did not go back for help. There was no time. 6 armed enemy soldiers and 1 American lieutenant who had already decided that the tanks and the men behind him mattered more than his own odds. He took them alone. Daly worked forward to a firing position and opened up on the German patrol before they could spring their ambush, and instantly became the target for everything they had, machine pistol and rocket fire blasting the rubble apart around him. He did not stop. Calmly, methodically, from that completely exposed spot, he kept firing until he had killed all 6 of the enemy patrol and destroyed the ambush that had threatened the tanks. 2 actions now, in one morning, both alone, both out in front, a machine gun crew and a 6-man patrol gone, and Michael Daly, still at the head of his company, still moving forward into the ruined city, was not finished. There were 2 more to come. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. The advance pushed on into a park, an open green space in the middle of the wreckage, exactly the kind of exposed ground that gets men killed in city fighting, and exactly as his company moved into it, a German machine gun opened up on them without warning. For the 3rd time that morning, Michael Daly answered it himself. With his carbine, he shot the gunner dead, but the rest of the gun crew was still there, still a threat, and so Daly did the thing that runs through his whole citation like a thread. He took a completely exposed position, out in the open, where the enemy could see and hit him, and from there he directed and delivered fire onto the remainder of the crew until every one of them was dead. He would not take cover while that gun could still kill his men. And then the 4th. As the company kept fighting through the streets, Daly came up against yet another German machine gun emplacement, the 3rd of the morning, and he destroyed this one too, with rifle fire, at a range of about 10 yards. 10 yards. That is how close he was. Close enough to see the faces of the men behind the gun, close enough that there was no margin for error at all, 1 man against a machine gun at the distance of a small room. He wiped it out, 4 separate times in a single morning, the first crew, the 6-man patrol, the crew in the park, and now this emplacement at 10 yards. Michael Daly had walked out ahead of his company, alone, into fire that should have killed him, and destroyed the thing that was killing his men. Add it up and it is almost hard to believe it was 1 man on one morning. In the course of that single advance through Nuremberg, Michael Daly had, single-handedly, killed roughly 15 German soldiers and destroyed 3 machine gun nests and a rocket-armed patrol, clearing, essentially by himself, the positions that were blocking his company's path through the city. He had not done it from cover, or at a safe distance, or by ordering someone else forward. He had done it by repeatedly, deliberately, walking out in front of his own men into the most dangerous place on the battlefield, because he had decided that was his job. His Medal of Honor citation would sum it up in a single phrase. By fearlessly engaging in 4 single-handed firefights, he had broken the German resistance in his path. And it very nearly cost him everything. Not that morning, but the next. Because the story of Michael Daly at Nuremberg does not end with the 4th machine gun. It ends the following day, the 19th of April, with a single German bullet, and it is one of the cruelest near misses of the entire war. To understand it, and to understand how a 20-year-old lieutenant came to be the kind of man who would walk alone into fire 4 times before lunch, we have to follow him one more day forward, and then all the way back to a beach in Normandy, 11 months earlier. But first, the next morning. Because on the 19th of April, Michael Daly's luck, which had held through so much, finally ran out. On the 19th of April, 1945, the day after his 4 one-man fights, Michael Daly was still leading his company through Nuremberg, still doing the same job, still out in the dangerous front of things, and a German sniper, hidden somewhere in the ruins, put a single bullet through his face. It was a catastrophic, very nearly fatal wound. The lieutenant, who had walked untouched through 4 separate firefights the day before, was cut down in an instant by one shot he never saw coming, and for a while it was not at all clear that he would live. He was pulled out of the line and evacuated, gravely wounded, his war over in the space of a single second, and all of it happening in the final days of the fighting, with the end of the war in Europe just weeks away. He lived. Michael Daly survived the wound that should have killed him, though it was a long, hard road back, and he carried the effects of it, and there is a terrible, poignant timing to it that is worth sitting with for a moment. He had landed on Omaha Beach on the first day of the invasion. He had fought across France and into Germany for 11 months. He had survived things that killed almost everyone around him, right up to and including a morning in which he personally destroyed 3 machine gun nests alone. And then, with the war in Europe all but won, days from the finish line, a sniper's bullet found him. He had spent 11 months at the very tip of the spear and had come within days and within inches of not seeing the peace he had done so much to win. For what he did in Nuremberg on the 18th of April, Michael Daly was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. That August, still recovering from the wound to his face, he was presented the medal at the White House by the President of the United States himself. A 20-year-old lieutenant, barely more than a boy, who had walked alone into fire 4 times in one morning in the ruins of the enemy's showpiece city. But here is the thing that the single morning in Nuremberg, extraordinary as it is, can hide. It was not a fluke, and it was not out of character. It was the last and largest act in 11 straight months of exactly this kind of courage, and to understand the man, you have to see the whole 11 months. Because Michael Daly did not arrive in Nuremberg as a stranger to this. The morning of the 4 fights was the culmination of a journey that had begun 11 months earlier and 1,000 miles away, on the bloodiest beach of the D-Day invasion, and that had already, along the way, made him one of the most decorated young soldiers in the entire American army. To understand how a 20-year-old came to move through a machine-gun-infested city as though he had decided his own life was simply the cheapest tool he had for saving his men, we need to widen the lens all the way back to who he was, to the father whose shadow he grew up in, and to the 11 months of war that forged him. That is the context the morning in Nuremberg sits inside. Before we go all the way back, understand that the morning in Nuremberg was the top of a mountain Michael Daly had been climbing for 11 months. If this is the kind of history you want kept alive, the whole arc of a man, not just his most famous 10 minutes, subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is for. From the day he landed in Normandy to the day he was wounded in Nuremberg, Daly fought almost continuously across Europe, and he was decorated again and again for doing, on a smaller scale, the very thing he would do 4 times in Nuremberg, going forward, exposing himself, drawing the enemy's fire onto himself to save the men around him. 3 separate times he was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. He earned a Bronze Star for valor. He was wounded and came back. Look at what those earlier medals were actually for, and you see the Nuremberg morning coming from a long way off. 1 Silver Star, earned as a private, very early in the fighting, was for deliberately exposing himself to heavy artillery and small arms fire to secure an advanced position. Another, month later, was for leading his platoon in overrunning a German strongpoint and taking it despite fierce resistance. A third was for drawing heavy enemy fire onto himself on purpose to cover his patrol's withdrawal, killing 2 Germans in the process. Do you see the pattern? Every one of them is the same act as Nuremberg, just smaller. Michael Daly, again and again, putting his own body between the enemy's fire and his men. By April 1945, he had been doing it for the better part of a year. Nuremberg was not a surprise. It was who he had become. And in that time, the young man rose. He had gone to Europe as an enlisted man, a private, one of the countless anonymous riflemen who did the actual fighting, and his conduct under fire was so consistent, so reliable, that the army did something it did not do lightly. It gave him a battlefield commission, promoting him from the enlisted ranks to become an officer, right there in the middle of the war, on the strength of what he had shown in combat. From private to lieutenant, from rifleman to company commander, and finally to a captain's rank. Michael Daly climbed that ladder not in a classroom, but on the battlefields of France and Germany, one act of courage at a time. But to really understand where all of it came from, we have to go back before the war entirely, to a boy in Connecticut and to his father. Because Michael Daly's story does not begin on Omaha Beach. It begins with a name he was trying to live up to, a military academy he could not stand, and a decision, at 18, to throw away the safe and honored path in front of him and go be a private in the infantry instead. To understand the man who walked alone into Nuremberg, you have to understand the boy who insisted on going to war the hard way, and the father whose shadow he grew up in. So let us widen the lens all the way back to who Michael Daly was before the war made him a legend. This is the context that the whole story sits inside. Michael Joseph Daly was born in 1924 and grew up in Fairfield, Connecticut, the son of a genuine war hero. His father, Paul Daly, had been decorated for extraordinary bravery in the First World War, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross, and he was the kind of formidable, demanding father whose shadow a son could either wither in or try to match. Michael grew up in that shadow, and when the Second World War came, his father, remarkably, volunteered again and went off to fight himself, first in the Pacific and then as a regimental commander in France. So young Michael Daly came from a family where extraordinary courage in war was not a legend on the wall. It was the standard set by the man at the head of the dinner table. It shaped everything about how he would fight. The expected path for such a son was West Point, the United States Military Academy, and Michael Daly went there. But he could not stand it. The rigid discipline and the endless petty regulations of academy life did not suit him at all, and he ran into constant trouble. After a single year, he resigned his appointment, walking away from the prestigious, safe road to an officer's commission. And here is the extraordinary part. He did it not to avoid the war, but to get into it faster. Michael Daly gave up West Point in order to enlist as an ordinary private, and in that lowly rank, as an 18-year-old, he was sent to England, trained, and then landed with the first waves on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, the bloodiest sector of the entire D-Day invasion. That is where his 11 months began. From Omaha Beach, Daly fought inland and eastward with the long, grinding Allied advance, through the hedgerows of France, into Germany, where he was wounded near Aachen and sent to England to recover, and then healed, back into the line with the 3rd Infantry Division for the final drive into the heart of Germany. By April 1945, that drive had reached Nuremberg, and Nuremberg mattered, symbolically, more than almost any other German city, because of what the Nazi regime had made it, the site of its massive party rallies, the stage set of its whole movement. Taking Nuremberg was, in a sense, tearing down one of the regime's proudest symbols in its final days. That is the city Michael Daly's company was fighting through, street by street, when he walked out ahead of them for the first time that morning. So hold the whole picture now. A boy raised in the shadow of a decorated father, a young man who threw away West Point to fight as a private, 11 months from the sands of Omaha Beach through France and into Germany, decorated again and again for putting himself between the enemy and his men, and finally a morning in the ruins of the Nazis' own showpiece city, where all of it came together in 4 single-handed fights. Knowing the whole road, the morning in Nuremberg stops looking like a burst of madness and starts looking like exactly what it was, the fullest expression of a courage that had been building, medal by medal, for 11 months. And what Michael Daly did with the long life that a sniper very nearly took from him is the quiet, fitting end to the story. Michael Daly recovered from the wound to his feet, slowly and never entirely, and then, like so many of his generation, he simply went home and became an ordinary man. He returned to Fairfield, Connecticut, the town he had grown up in, and he lived there for the rest of his life. He started a family, he went into business, he became a respected, civic-minded member of his community, a man who gave his time to good causes, by many accounts, especially quietly devoted to helping the sick and the wounded, perhaps because he knew something about being both. He did not trade on his medal or his fame. He was, to his neighbours, simply Mike Daly of Fairfield, a decent, modest local man, most of whom, on any given day, had no idea that the pleasant fellow they knew had once cleared a path through Nuremberg alone. He lived a long life, carrying his war quietly, and he died in 2008 at the age of 83 in the same Connecticut town he had always called home. And when he died, the people who knew the full story understood that one of the truly extraordinary soldiers of the Second World War had just passed. A man who had done, in a single morning in Nuremberg, more than most soldiers do in an entire war, and who had then spent 60 years being humble about it. Michael Daly belongs to that vanishing generation of men who did impossible things in their youth, and then came home and quietly built the ordinary, decent world the rest of us live in. The lieutenant who walked alone into the ruins became the neighbour who helped build a hospital. Same courage, same man, just turned at last toward peace. Lieutenant, and later Captain, Michael Joseph Daly of Fairfield, Connecticut, of Company A, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, the general's son who threw away West Point to fight as a private, who landed at Omaha Beach at 18, who earned 3 Silver Stars in 11 months of walking into the enemy's fire to save his men, and who on one morning in the ruins of Nuremberg went forward alone 4 times and destroyed 3 machine gun nests and a rocket patrol before a sniper's bullet very nearly ended him the next day, was one of the bravest young men America sent to that war. He came home, and he built a good and quiet life. Somewhere the descendants of the men in his company are alive today because their lieutenant kept walking out in front of them. There is a simple, terrible arithmetic at the center of Michael Daly's story, and he seems to have solved it the same way every single time. When his men were pinned and someone had to go forward into the fire, he could send another man or he could go himself. And 4 times in one morning, and dozens of times across 11 months, he chose to go himself. That is the whole of it. Not a death wish, not recklessness, but a settled, repeated decision that his own life was the thing he was most willing to spend to protect the lives of the men who followed him. He nearly spent it entirely, days from the end, and the men behind him lived because he did. Michael Daly came home to Fairfield and lived quietly for 60 years, and most people never knew what he had done, which is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family landed at Omaha Beach, or fought across France and into Germany, or served with the 3rd Infantry Division, or came home from any war and simply never talked about it, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or said, or one thing you remember. The men who walked into the fire so the others could live deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.